Hello world, I'm Whitney Bandel and welcome to another video from my HTML and CSS course. In this video we will be looking at web page files and testing and validation. So to start off, we're going to be looking at the first link under web publishing, which is a PowerPoint. So web publishing basics. So to start off with, we're going to look at domain name basics. Domain names are the name of the website, the name following at in an email address, or after www in a web address. Examples are google.com, wikipedia.org, or jccc.edu. Domain names usually cost about $30 a year. Now, the difference between a domain name versus a URL. A URL is a complete web address used to find a particular web page. While a domain is the name of the website, a URL will lead to any one of those pages within the website. Every URL contains a domain name, as well as other components needed to locate that specific page or a piece of content. So some examples would be www.google.com, en.wikipedia/wiki/umami, www.youtube/feed/trending. So looking at specific pages or areas within a site in addition to just the domain. So to start off with, you need to register a domain name. Here are some tips for things to consider. It should make sense based off of what the website actually is. You want to keep it short, so that way it's less likely that someone might forget what the domain name is, or so that way they don't have a hard time trying to type it all out. You want to avoid using hyphens because they can overly complicate. You can use more than .com. A lot of people will choose .com, but nowadays there are a lot more options for other alternatives that you can use, and sometimes there are alternatives that will make more sense based off of the type of content your website actually has. You want to avoid using trademarked words that other established companies are using, so that way you don't encounter any sort of problems with those companies. And you want to have an idea of what other people are using, so that way you, again, aren't using trademarked words, but then you're also seeing what common trends are. You can verify the availability of different domain names. Here are a couple of different websites that you can go to that will be able to let you know whether or not a domain name is available or not. Now, there's a difference between purchasing a domain name and actually hosting your website. So purchasing a domain name is different than hosting your website, though usually you will do both together. A web hosting service provider provides technologies and services needed for the website or web page to be viewed in the internet. Websites are hosted or stored on special computers called servers. The domain name points to this storage when people type in the IP address. So when you are purchasing web hosting, you are purchasing the ability to store your website on one of these servers, and then the domain name will allow for people to access that location. So you can purchase them separately. You can purchase a domain name and transfer it between different web hosting companies. So here is a link on how you can try to find the best web host for you. You will be completing an assignment which will build off of this idea, where you will be required to do some research, but this can help you figure out what sort of web host is going to be best for you. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer. It's going to depend a lot on a bunch of different type of criteria. This graphic is a little bit old, but it shows you 10 top web hosting providers back in 2014. Now, when you are creating your website and you're thinking of these key terms, for example, for your domain name, you want to consider search engine optimization. So, a couple of tips: use keywords that people might search for. A good example I'd like to use for this is the idea of looking for help with your car. So, for example, my husband used to work as a mechanic, and he liked to call himself an automotive technician. But if somebody was experiencing car trouble and they wanted to look to see how to get their car fixed, if they were to go into a search engine, rather than typing up automotive technician, they're probably going to use words that are more common, such as mechanic. They might look for car repair. They might look for a name of a typical website that they know to go to for looking up car related help. They might not use words that are more valid or more used in the industry. They're going to be looking for layman terms. So you want to think about the types of keywords that people are actually going to be searching for, even if they technically aren't as appropriate. Use descriptive page titles. So you want to have your titles describe the content, and again, be common terms that people are going to be familiar with. And then finally, you want to use semantic HTML. Now, since we are studying HTML5, you are going to be using semantic HTML anyways. Semantic HTML is making sure that you are actually using your HTML properly in a way where the structure makes sense with the elements that you are using. For example, putting your header content inside of a header element, putting your navigation links inside of an element that's actually called a navigation element, and so on. So some things that you can do with SEO is creating these description tags. To add a description tag, you will create a meta name and list it as a description. You can choose what the content is going to be equal to. To keep search engines from indexing a website, you can actually add properties that will make it harder for the search engine to actually comb through your content. So here we have content, no index, no follow. To indicate not to index the whole website, you can also create this disallow, which will prevent the whole website from being indexed. How to make your website SEO friendly. Verify that all hyperlinks work. Be careful which links you use from other websites. You want to make sure you don't have any awkward dead ends, or that you're not linking to questionable websites, which will bring the reputation of your website down. Use meaningful alternative text descriptions for your images. Make sure that you validate your code and that your code meets the proper standards. Make sure your content is good. You want to make sure that you don't have any spelling or grammar errors. You want to make sure that your content isn't out of date. You don't have a bunch of pages that just say coming soon. Include keywords in titles, headers, first paragraphs, and hyperlinks. So when you're thinking of those key terms, you want to make sure that you are repeating them, so that way it's easier for people to skim through your information and find exactly what's pertinent to them. So some general web file naming conventions. Use all lowercase when you are naming your files. Use hyphens instead of spaces. Your file links will not recognize white spaces, so you will get an error if you use spaces in your links. So you want to make sure that if you do have multiple words and you want to make them more legible, that you use hyphens instead of spaces. Avoid using any sort of special character. Make your files brief. You don't want to have a really long file name. You want to keep it as short as possible while making it still legible and make sense. Use a name that reflects the file. Be careful with version names. So this really comes down to how you're going to be linking files. If you're working on a really large website, it can be really difficult to go back and actually have to reversion everything. Let's say you have a photo that is just referred to as photo.jpg. Let's say you wanted to replace a photo and the new photo was called photo maybe v2 for version 2. If you bring that file in without changing the link name, now that file is no longer going to be linked properly in your HTML. So what a lot of times I'll encourage you to do is if you are going to have version names, that you keep those separate and then you copy them into a new file where you will rename the file with the file name that works with the current link that's on that website. So next we're going to look at publishing with File Transfer Protocol, and we will have a separate video which will show you how to work with FileZilla in order to publish your files. FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol. It's used for transfer of computer files between a client and a server. Your web host might have their own service for transferring files. Otherwise, you can use an FTP software like FileZilla. FileZilla is the one that we're going to be using. When you are researching your web hosts, you might find that some of them talk a little bit about their own transferring file system. And some of them are actually more client friendly because they have more of a click and drop sort of setup rather than having to go through another software. File validation. You can validate your code files before publishing them to your website, and I encourage you to do this with every single one of your assignments that you will turn in. Once they are published, you should use the W3 School Validator to check your HTML and your CSS files. So here are again those two links, the first taking you to the validator for HTML, and the second to the CSS validator. When you are looking at your files, you should test them in different browsers. So a couple to consider. Chrome is the most commonly used on mobile devices. So if you are looking at how your website looks on a mobile device, you definitely want to check it with Chrome. In addition to any other browser that you want, Firefox is most commonly used on PC desktops. And then Safari is most commonly used on Mac devices, both desktop and mobile. Next, you need to make sure that you consider accessibility testing. To determine whether a website meets accessibility requirements, you can visit the two links below. At these two websites, you can go and place a link and have them give you feedback on whether or not it's accessible. You can also find these two links under the resources category. Usability testing. Here are a couple of different things to consider when you are doing usability testing. To evaluate the website, you will want to consider the following: intuitive design, how easy it is for a new user to understand the organization of the site; ease of learning, how do experienced users perceive the website; efficiency of use, how do experienced users perceive the website; memorability, when a visitor returns to a website, do they remember enough to use it productively; error frequency and severity, do visitors make errors, how easy is it to recover from the error; subject satisfaction, do users like using the website. So what I want us to do with this is actually practice this in action. So we're going to go back to the website that we visited in the other video, this Johnson County website, jocogov.org, and I want you to go to the discussion thread for this, and I want you to answer each of these following items and take a look at each of these categories for this website. And then I want you to rank how the website does, let's say a score out of 10, and then give an overall ranking for this. Alright, hopping back to Canvas, you can see those same links that we looked at, if you go to the web publishing subsection, we have our PowerPoint, these different resource links, validator, the accessibility links, and then your homework for this week.